The next session is on understanding complex systems. So we've talked about vigilance and being aware of risk and uncertainty in the environment. Now this session is much more about understanding the nature of that environment, both internally within the organisation and more broadly across organisations. So I'm going to try and pick up on some of these concepts in the some of these issues in the in this session. Okay, so we have Elmar's blob diagram. Not sure how much help that is, but I'll put it in there. Right, so the key issues for this session are thinking about systems. Organisations are systems. Most organisations, certainly any medium, large-size organisations, are complex systems operating within wider, complex ecosystems. So it's understanding organisations and organisational networks as from a systems perspective. Okay, there's another issue is the limitations in simplifying complex systems and a risk planning for those complex systems. So I'll talk about the tendency for people within organisations to think of systems as somehow simple and thinking of them in simplistic ways, which is in itself a problem. And then finally, another key issue is for people within organisations to find ways of making sense of these complex systems. How can people operating within these complex systems make sense of them? When you make sense of them, if you're able to make sense of them, then you're able to better understand them and understand their frailties and weaknesses and address those weaknesses. Okay, so I talked about simplifying systems, and simplicity is one of the lures we talk about in some of our research. So the process of simplification, we said the process of simplification is in itself inherently risky. It can encourage complacency and an ignorance of the complexity and attendant risks and uncertainties associated with that complexity. One can argue that the organisation is complicit in a kind of delusion. Really what we're getting at is it's a delusion of simplicity. We think that things are simple. We like to think of things in simple little parts and little silos. And if you think of complex systems like that, it kind of enables you to make sense of them in your own head. Because the complexity is too difficult to hold in one person's head. So it enables people to make sense of what's going on, how their organisation fits into other organisations, what in fact is the nature of their own organisation. What we're arguing here is that's a delusion. We delude ourselves into thinking things are simple when in fact they're much more complex. And that in itself is a risk. Okay, so as usual, I'll start with a section on impediments. The things stopping people making sense of organisations or understanding organisations more clearly. There's a number of points here which you can investigate in more detail. I'll only pick up on some of these. So the first one I'm going to talk about is optimism bias, or laughing in the face of reality. Optimism bias is a kind of well-known psychological construct, really, that people are over-optimistic when they go into or start or engage in new ventures. So there we are, how much greener the grass is with these rose-tinted glasses. Okay, so the nature of optimism bias. So Kahneman is a very famous, Daniel Kahneman is a very famous, was a very famous, he died recently, was a very famous economic psychologist, academic, and he's made many contributions to the field of organisational thinking, psychology and economics. One of the ones he picked up on was optimism bias. You can see that this paper in the Harvard Business Review that he published with Lavallo is called Delusions of Success, How Optimism Undermines Executives' Decisions. Really, really useful way of thinking about how optimism bias can be a real problem for people within organisations. Some of the things that he picks up on are anchoring. Anchoring is focusing on or over-focusing on one thing and not understanding the broader context of decisions, neglecting competitor actions, and not really scanning the wider environment and picking up on things that competitors are doing, exaggerating the abilities of people within the organisation, or the capabilities of the organisation, and the control it has over both its own actions and the outcomes of its actions. Approving proposals with the highest probability of failure. This is a kind of strange finding from Kahneman's research, that's what happens. High probability of failure is ignored because, or is pursued because of the attendant reward, or what people hope is an attendant reward. But actually what you end up with is, strange enough, failed proposals. And rewarding optimism and seeing pessimism as disloyalty. Really interesting. So people end up being optimistic because that's what gets rewarded. Pessimism, having a voice which casts doubt on things, being, as we say in some of our research, the doomsayer, talking about risk, discussing risk, the taboo of risk, is seen as disloyalty by executives and senior management in organisations. So there's a real tendency towards optimism bias. Okay, one of the attendant aspects of that is normalisation and deviance. So Vaughan, who I mentioned, Diane Vaughan, in her discussion of the Challenger launch and her investigation of that, came up with this idea of normalisation and deviance. Deviant behaviour becomes normalised, becomes normal activity and normal behaviour within organisations. I created this little model based on her research. So we start with point one, which is what she calls missteps, flawed assumptions, and crucially, a culture of risk-taking. A culture of risk-taking becoming a normal activity, becoming, as she called it, commonplace. This leads to people becoming so accustomed to deviant behaviour that they don't consider it deviant, despite the fact that they far exceed their own rules for elementary safety. People grow accustomed to deviant behaviour, the more it occurs. And then this becomes a vicious cycle, a cycle of ever-increasing risk-taking behaviour, which becomes more and more embedded within the culture of the organisation and becomes normal and commonplace. You can probably see how this is very closely related to practical drift, which I talked about last time. And of course, this goes on, this cycle goes on until something goes wrong. She was obviously looking at the Challenger launch, but we can think about how this might apply to other organisational situations. In the teaching session, I talked about this very famous case a few years back of the ship which sank. This is the Costa Concordia, and it was it sank after the captain of the ship was taking ridiculous risks, but these risks had become normal. He'd done it over and over again, became optimistic about his ability to control his situation, didn't recognise the complexity of the environment within which he was sailing his ship, and lo and behold, it sank when he ran it onto rocks, and with obviously attendant massive cost damages, but also people actually got killed in this. So it was a major disaster for the organisation, for the industry, I guess. Anyway, so another concept which is interesting is, I think is interesting, is organisational amnesia. Kransdorff, you can see down there at the bottom, wrote this book called Corporate Amnesia. I've called it Organisational Amnesia. One of the key points that Kransdorff picks up is that companies frequently repeat previous blunders. We make the same mistakes over and over again. How is it possible that we can make a massive mistake and then 5, 10, 15 years down the line make the same mistake? How is that possible? He looked into this, and I noticed that people have the inability to draw from past experience, that we don't look back, we always look forward. It's normal, it's natural human behaviour, not to dwell on the past mistakes, but to look forward to future possibilities. We also have the inability to communicate lessons from one part of the organisation to the other. So organisations are complex, full of silos and groups, and communicating lessons of failure or risk or vulnerability is very difficult across organisations. Okay, the obverse to organisational amnesia would be organisational memory. The problem with organisational memory is it's very difficult to capture. You can think about it as learning. How do we learn from the past? Part of the problem here is that organisational memory is tacit, which means it's held in people's heads, very rarely written down. If it's written down or made explicit in some way, then that explicit document or whatever it is tends to get lost. So for organisations, it's important to find ways of trying to spread tacit memory across the organisation. Memory is also contemporary and contiguous. Contemporary in that it's in and of its time, and contiguous in that it's connected and spreads across organisations in a very from point to point where there's connections. So not necessarily in the way you want it to spread, but in the way it just naturally spreads through storytelling, through gossip, those sort of things. Returning to Kahneman and Tversky, his long-term collaborator, they came up with the very famous concept of prospect theory, which is useful for our point of view in thinking about how people behave in decisions which are risky. And so I guess some key points from this were that people make decisions based on potential value of losses and gains rather than the final outcome. And this is a kind of important because what it does is it leads to irrational behaviour. It gives rise to what they call violations of first order stochastic dominance. And what that essentially means is that because people don't really understand intuitively understand the issues around probability, they make decisions which are seemingly irrational. That leads to failure, it leads to loss, and that loss, managers then try to recover that loss by making increasingly risky decisions. It's like gambling, effectively. So people within organisations take risks, which is a kind of gamble, and they lose on those risks because they make the wrong gambles, they make large gambles, take large risks, inappropriate risks, without really understanding the probability of the risk, and then they lose and they try to make up for lost ground. And this leads to all sorts of problems for organisations. It gets worse and worse and worse for organisations. Okay, so there's some of the problems. Let's think about how organisations can overcome some of these problems. Okay, the key thing here is to think about organisations as systems. So this is a kind of complex map showing systems within systems within systems. We've got subsystems and broader systems, environmental systems, boundaries around systems, but those boundaries overlap and are permeable. Parts cross those boundaries. So you can see that there's all sorts of complexity in systems. As an example, this is an air transport system. So what I'm getting at here is understanding organisations as systems, and in starting to understand them as systems, what we can do is start to make sense of the complexity. Okay, so in the air transport system, we have an aircraft system, which is both involves people and complex computerization, but also mechanical systems as well. Each of those, of course, has their own subsystems. So the navigation system down there, you can see, has subsystems within the navigation system, which is then interconnected with everything else in the aircraft system. That in itself is part of the air transport system. So we have an organisation, the airline, which connects with airport systems, with ticketing systems, with air traffic control systems, fuel distribution systems. It's a whole, plus lots of others, I'm sure. There's a whole load of systems wrapped up in the air transport system, which is in itself connected with the ground transport system, with maritime transport system, and crosses into all sorts of other systems as well. So you can start to see how complex things are. There's component and element interfaces. So you can see that the components, the parts of the system, interface with other parts of the system. and the systems themselves interface with one another. Okay, so there's a huge amount of complexity. And one of the great benefits of systems thinking is to get to grips with and try to tame this complexity. Okay, so my friend Robin Holt wrote an article for In Organisation a few years back where he talked about thinking about different risks within systems along 4 categories. So across the top there you've got tame risks, messy risks, wicked risks, and wicked messes. Okay, and across and down each of these we've got the issues in terms of where this is taking these types of risks are taking people and organisations, the nature of the risk, examples. I've got a few examples there, and how these can be resolved or made sense of. Okay, so tame risks are really those risks which are technical in nature, have low levels of behavioural complexity. Okay, so for that we have ends or goals are prescribed and clear and apparent. The nature of the risk is normally technical, engineering type risk. So analytic or algorithmic solutions can be used to deal with those risks. Examples might be lexical ordering, getting things in the right order, analytical geometry, those sort of things. And the resolution is linear, straightforward, self-referential dialogue. We work through the solution and come up with a solution and resolve the risk. Frankly, a lot of the risk management is in the field or in the area of tame risk. Okay, because these are risks which we can readily make sense of. Messy risks are where those kind of risks, well, in Holt's topology, those kind of risks which are quite incredibly complex engineering or technical risks, but still have a relatively low level of behavioural complexity. Here, the destination, the ends and means are not necessarily well understood, and certainly to a lesser or greater degree. The nature of the risk is iterative and pan-system. It's operating cross systems. It's interconnected and evolutionary. It's emerging. Okay. Examples we've got there are architecture, epidemic control, lean production, migration patterns. These are all kind of messy risks. They're technical things going on, but with relatively low levels of behavioural input into them. Kind of resolutions to these kind of risks are explorative, non-linear, and in particular systems analysis. And this enables us to get to grips with messy risk situations. Next we have wicked risks. These are ones which probably have a relatively low level of technical complexity, but have high levels of behavioural complexity. Lots of cultural factors involved in there, lots of different stakeholders, those sort of things. Here the end is never fixed. It always moves, it's always shifting. And this means always invoking qualitative judgments and variable methodologies. The nature of the risk is trial and error. We don't really, because it's not technical, it's about people, it's about behaviour and people and the interactions between people, which creates the risk. There's no final strategies, disciplines from constant testing. Okay, examples include diversity policies, psychometric testing, those sort of things. Resolution is exploratory, non-linear. It's about things like disposition analysis, those sort of things. Okay, finally we have the real problem, wicked messes. Okay, this is where we have both technical complexity together with high levels of behavioural complexity. Here, the end is non-existent. It's a worldview. It's about ontology and epistemology. Plausible alternative solutions can always be found because everyone has a stake in the situation. The nature of the risk is holistic. It's structural and mental. It's both structural in terms of technical, risky difficulties, and also mental and cognitive in terms of the way people interact. Examples Holt comes up with are urban design, ecological management, those sort of things, which, as you can understand, are very complex. The resolution for these kind of risks, there isn't much in the way of resolution. It's about imagination, about chaos and rhetoric, convincing, persuading people of a particular viewpoint. And what I've tried to do is arrange those risks in this model. So again, this is from Robin Holt's piece of work, and you can see that we have technical complexity on the bottom axis and behavioral complexity on the y-axis, and I've arranged the different types of risk around this model to try and show you how they relate to one another. And it's tame, messy, wicked risks are all kind of be understood from risk management perspectives. In the wicked miss zone, in the wicked zones, you're getting into very difficult areas to make sense of, to understand, to control. At the bottom there, tame and messy risks, their solution is largely technical and scientific. At the top there, you'll see that the resolution is for behavioural kind of risks are much more social, political, ethical, moral, behavioural, all sorts of much more difficult kinds of solution. Why is this important? It's important because it relates to both complex systems which give rise to these risks or the different types of risk, and also interesting from the point of view of risk itself, how we make sense of risk, whether we even consider risk as a factor, and if we do consider it, then how do we cope with it, how do we make sense of it. Here's another part of the model. So we start with the problem. Is it tame? If it's tame, essentially we know why it's a problem. It's a technical problem. We know how it's a problem. So we have some sort of solution to solve. We gather, analyse data and formulate and implement solutions. So this is a situation which is very kind of understandable to people within organisations. You can understand technical risks quite clearly, make sense of them, and then do something about them. If it's a messy risk, then we understand why it's a problem maybe, but not necessarily how it will manifest itself. What can we do there? We can resolve the messiness through things like cross-functional groups, rich pictures, those sort of things. With wicked risks, which are, remember, behavioural, we kind of might understand why it's a problem, how we may not understand why it's a problem, or even how it's a problem. Here, what's the best we can do? We can't manage these risks easily. The best we can do really is dissolve the wickedness through satisficing and the Moscow method, what we must have, should have, could have, and would like, those sort of things. You'll notice that on this model, Robin didn't come up with one for wicked messes, and really that's because it's so complex and so difficult to understand. The solution is really more political than anything else. Okay, one of the problems this gives rise to is the focus on those easy to manage, easy to understand risks, and the idea that there's a cause and effect, what we call scientific reductionism, that we understand the world as a scientific process, and that's why we focus on those things, or try to understand risks and uncertainty as a scientific equation. So the classic way of thinking about this is desired outcome Y is achieved by action X. We assume there's a link between the two. Breaking down a problem to allow for more examination of cause and effect relationships by breaking things down into their indivisible parts. But do all the parts equal the system? Probably not. We are only looking at partial representation of the system. The indivisible parts may not be enough for us to allow us to have sufficient insight into real situations. All we're doing is having a partial view of what's going on within the system. And the relationships between those parts may produce other properties which we can't even understand or haven't envisaged. This is about mutual causality. We assume that it's one way, that we assume the cause X leads to Y, whereas in fact X leads to Y, which may in turn change X. So what we're talking about here is that cause and effect relationships often work both ways, or in ways we hadn't even thought about. Okay, this interdependency requires an approach which examines their interactions. So the example I have here is poverty results in poor health, and poor health leads to further poverty. Okay. Another point which you might want to think about is unintended consequences. Okay, so thinking about systems, unintended consequences of, for example, the Aswan Dam. Here is a picture of the Aswan Dam, which I've actually visited in the past. Okay, here is a picture of one of the things that had to be done. All these amazing ancient artifacts had to be cut up at great expense and moved, because otherwise they'd have disappeared under the reservoir created by the dam. And there is a picture of the dam from the air. You can see there's a big reservoir behind the dam, and then the Nile carries on further up. Okay, so what was the purpose? The purpose of the Aswan Dam was the desire of Egypt to control the Nile floods. Interestingly, there was a broad backdrop to this particular project. It was begun against a system of political background, tense political background rather. The monarchy had been overthrown in Egypt in the early 50s. The USA and USSR were in the midst of a Cold War, the beginnings of a Cold War. There was a Suez Crisis in 1956, so lots of things going on in the background which were all impacting on the way in which this dam might be understood and be developed. Okay, the intentions were that they would mitigate the disastrous effects of the flooding incidents, that farmland be increased by up to 500%, and that they create enormous amounts of power. But then there are undesirable or unintended consequences. 60,000 people were displaced. The silt, which had fertilised the land, which was brought down from the Upper Nile, no longer was getting there. So the land became unproductive, and so artificial fertilizers needed to be used. Poor irrigation damaged farmable land through salinization. It all became very salty. The silt which would have been fertilizing the land accumulated behind the dam, reducing its water capacity. Okay, the nutrients which were used to come down the Nile and into the Mediterranean were no longer doing so, and so the Mediterranean fisheries were affected because the fish had less nutrients fewer nutrients going into the Mediterranean. The microscopic sea life had nothing to feed on, that all died off, and so the fish died off as well. There was a large red brick construction industry using the silt which was accumulating in the estuary of the Nile, and that was damaged by the fact there was less silt coming down. And there was lots of standing water. This led to the breeding of snails. These snails have parasites. These parasites led to an increase in this horrible eye disease called schistosomiasis, which was a result of these breeding snails. So you can see there are all sorts of unexpected consequences, but these were all going to happen. They're all going to happen because they were all connected to the system, which was the dam. The focus is on the dam and the desirable outcomes. People didn't see or didn't want to see these undesirable outcomes. So the solution to this, or one of the solutions to this, is to think about systems thinking. And it's a toolkit of managerial techniques. It's all kind of well understood and well used. We have requirements generation, analysis of systems, modelling of systems, testing and verification of changes within systems. We can use extensively in project management. The key applications are systems engineering and something which I'll talk about in some depth, which is soft systems methodology. Okay, this is a video. You can watch a video yourself. I showed it in class of an example of systems engineering. It's actually an advert for IBM, but gives you a good insight into how powerful systems engineering in using computerized software can enable a good grasp of and quick decision making and understand the impacts of changes within systems, complex technical systems, that is. Okay, what I want to concentrate on a little bit more is because systems engineering is so well understood, I want to concentrate a little bit more on soft systems methodologies, ways of understanding the more complex, wicked and wicked, messy risks and systems factors which might arise. Okay, so soft systems methodology is a framework for users to deal with all kinds of messy problem situations that lack a formal problem definition. Okay, perfect for complex systems involving technical aspects and complex behavioural situations, which is most organisations actually. Okay, the focus on the epistemological nature of systems. So I've got an example there. Systems might be to make profit or to produce products or to provide jobs or whatever it is. Probably most organisations are doing all these. So the focus is on what we're trying to do in terms of the system. It emerged out of the failure of systems engineering. Systems engineering is great for managing complex engineering problems, but it fails when we get into the broader systems effects of people as part of that system. Okay, it was used in the Concorde, which itself was problematic, but certainly found its starting point in the Concorde project, which is the first supersonic, the only supersonic passenger airline. It was devised to make sense of all sorts of complexity, as I've kind of illustrated. Okay, so some of the assumptions in soft system methodology. Organisational problems are messy. So said Ackoff talked about this, and we kind of know this. They're poorly defined. Stakeholders interpret problems differently. In other words, there is no objective reality. What I think is important and useful might be different to what you think is important and useful. Okay, human factors are important. It's not just about technical factors. It's about people and technical systems working together. We can come up with this creative, intuitive approach to problem solving, which is soft systems methodology. The outcomes are learning and better understanding rather than solution. Again, this really feeds into what Robin Holt was talking about in terms of no clear solution, no clear way through. You have to just find a way through which you work through and you come up with some better understanding, better appreciation of what's going on. Through that appreciation, organisations can better understand themselves and understand their broader environments. Peter Checkland is one of the key protagonists in this field of research and field of thinking, and he came up with his 7-stage model. So we have above the line the real world, below the line thinking about the real world. So we have a situation we think is problematic, and that leads to a problem situation, that problem situation being expressed. We write it down, we make sense of it, we talk about it. After that, we can start to create a root definition of the relevant systems. This leads to conceptual models of systems being described in the root definitions. Then we can revisit the real world and compare the models we created against the real world. Does this make sense? Is it capturing the complexity? That leads to us being able to make changes. Are they systematically desirable? Are they culturally feasible? Do they make sense? And then we can create an action to improve the problem situation. Test it. Has it improved the situation? This 7-stage model becomes a continuous process. Okay. One of the key factors key tools which Checkland suggested were rich pictures. If you look at one of Checkland's books, there's a number of them. They're all very readable. I highly recommend them. He makes extensive use of rich pictures, drawings and diagrams, and you don't have to be a good drawer. All you need to be able to do is to use little icons to create rich pictures which try to help grasp the complexity of systems. In the lecture I went through the example here, which you can see here, is a classic example of students coming into a university and some of the factors they might need to deal with. And throughout this example, we have all sorts of human systems interacting together. One of the really useful outcomes of Peter Checkland's work on source systems methodology was what he called the CATWOE analysis. CATWOE stands for customers who are either the victims or the beneficiaries of T, which I'll get onto in a moment. Okay, actors who do T. Now T is transformation. It's basically an input-output perspective. So T is about, so we have customers or beneficiaries or victims of a transformation, actors who deliver that transformation. Okay, then what Checkland called Weltanschauung, which is essentially, this German word, essentially meaning the worldview, the environment within which T takes place. Okay, owners have the power to stop T happening, the transformation happening, and environmental constraints, things outside the system which taken as given, there are assumptions made about them, but nevertheless affect the behaviour of the transformation process. Okay, so going back to my example, we had the customers of the student application process being candidate students. The actors, the people enacting the change, enacting the transformation, being staff within the university. The change itself being candidate students arriving at a university and leaving the university with degrees and diplomas. The worldview in this situation is the belief that awarding degrees and diplomas is a good way of demonstrating qualities of candidates to potential employers. Okay. The owners, university governing body, and the environment, national education and assessment standards. So here is an example of how CATWOE works. You can apply this to virtually any kind of transformation system, and think about it from an operations perspective. You can start with the macro operation, or work your way all the way down to more micro operational systems. Okay, I posed a question. What do we mean by value? One way of seeing value lies in achieving a balance between satisfaction of many differing needs and the resources used in doing so. So many differing needs, many different customers, different customer contingents and constituencies, different people receiving outputs. The fewer resources used to create the greatest satisfaction is a way of understanding. It creates greater value. Okay. Now, value management integrates the manager's efforts with those of higher management by concentrating objectively on outcomes that are in line with corporate objectives in preference to local or short-term priorities. So what I'm getting at here is value. What is the greatest value, and how are we understanding value in terms of what organisations are doing? Okay, this is out of the value management by the British Standards Institute, these quotes. Okay, now from our point of view, in terms of resilience and reliability, what we're interested in is value-driven risk management. So the problem is risk is seen as anti-value. It's a waste. It's drawing resource away from value activities. Okay, the notion of value is closely tied to differing definitions of success. What do we mean by success? How do we understand success? So value-driven risk management is shifting that focus from detailed operational delivery to understanding what value means to customers, consumers and other stakeholders. Consequence of this kind of risk management is that risk management shifted to the risks that matter. If we understand where the value is, then we can look at the risks which impact on delivering that value. Okay, so it's a way of giving risk management a process, a way of being employed that focuses on value. Okay, finally, I'm going to talk about, or not quite finally, but I'm going to talk now about issues to enable interpretation. So there's a number of factors there, some which I'll pick up. Okay, first one we talked about in our book was filtering noise, what we call noise. Okay, so one of the key ways of thinking about what's going on in the environment, what's going on in the system, is to think: has this happened before? is what we're seeing an indication of something that's systemic? More importantly, might this influence a critical element of the operating system? So is this some way going to impact on our value and our ability to deliver value? How close are we to the source of the risk uncertainty? Do we need more information? And how quickly could this cascade into a bigger threat? Are we spotting the weak signals? One of the key things, certainly from a risk perspective, is to understand the big picture. How does what's going on here, in the here and now, impact on or represent a broader perspective of risk? Okay, so we might identify just one very small thing going on within the organisation, but this might be endemic, or it might be a representative of a much broader, more complex system. So it's big picture thinking. Okay, one of the things that Othman and Hashim talked about in Topologizing Organizational Amnesia in a paper was that learning takes place through intuition. That takes place through intuition does not affect the organization unless it is shared. Okay, so sharing is crucial as an aspect of learning, and some form of common meaning has to be attached to it. This involves a process of interpretation. So I've underlined the point interpretation. What we're doing with learning from risk and trying to share our knowledge and understanding of risk across a system is to interpret what's going on. Okay, in the lecture I talked about Pearl Harbor, and there's a little bit of background about Pearl Harbor. You can see the results of Pearl Harbor. Then I talked about was it a surprise? Could it have been prevented? The rhetoric is all that it's a surprise attack. It came from nowhere. Nobody could have predicted it. Actually, if you look at what happened, it was known. The Japanese communications were intercepted. The US Army and Navy understood and knew the intentions of the Japanese. A ship detected Japanese radar signals and passed this information on. Japanese ambassador in Washington was recalled. That's a signal something's going on. The knowledge that this was going to happen was diffuse, what is called space-based organizational amnesia, not really seeing what's happening across a broad and large organization. Okay, this is a quote from Nietzsche. When you look into the abyss looks back into you. Very famous quote. Okay, what is the abyss? The problem is that, and this is the real risk, problem that people within organisations face, it's just why we're drawn always to simplicity, is that what I've talked about over this session is complexity of systems, broad systems. I talked about wicked systems, risks, messy risks, wicked messy risks. I've talked, and no real resolution, no real way of seeing your way through. I've talked about soft systems methodology as a kind of way of trying to make sense of this, but even that isn't a solution. It's just a way of trying to understand it. I've talked about value, and I've talked about how value can be understood and is never quite clear. Value for one person is different to value for another person. So it might seem that you're looking into the abyss. You might seem that all this complexity is insurmountable. There aren't any clear solutions. The best we can hope for is half solutions. We don't satisfy anybody. The danger of this is we end up with a fatalist attitude, an ennui. We just hold our hands up and say, well, there's nothing I can do. The role of leadership is vital in this. It's about counteracting this ennui, counteracting this fatalism. There is something we can do. We can do something. It may not be perfect solution, but it is a solution, or it's a part solution. At least it gets us further along the line. It helps us to make sense of the risk. It helps us to make sense of the uncertainty and the complexity. Finally, thinking a little bit about interpretation across organisations. So, the example I used in the lecture was about the London Olympics. Okay, the London Olympics is a story of managing messages. The initial budget was actually 2.4 billion. This rose and rose and rose as new things emerged, and ended up being 9.3 billion pounds. The budget increases were clearly conveyed to the government, who are paying for a large part of this, and to the public more widely. Okay, media amazingly reported the games had come in under budget because they understood that all these increases were clearly made sense of, and the risks were always being taken into account. And the nature of those risks, the nature of the problems that the Olympics was facing, were always made clear and apparent to the public, to the media. We have an illusion of certainty. Management is in part about planning and control of complex activities. That's what management is, okay? But this leads to a delusion that complexity and uncertainty are somehow tameable, that we can turn all these complex, wicked and messy risks into something which is tame. The important thing is to seek to acknowledge that complexity and risk and develop resilient capabilities to deal with them. So in other words, this is just part of the picture. Okay, so I talked about in the earlier session about vigilance, noticing. Now we're on to noticing within a complex system. Okay, and then the case we looked at was the tactical strike and reconnaissance fighter. Right, so some takeaway points. Most organisations are complex systems, existing within more complex systems. Okay, a multiplicity of systems impose risk and uncertainty. It's the systems themselves and the complexity of those systems that creates risk. So the key issue for organisations is to understand complexity, the nature of complexity. It's systemic. Okay, understand the nature of complexity of risk. Also understand where value lies. Now, through understanding both the complexity and through understanding value, we can use this to focus our risk management efforts on those risks that matter. Finally, understand multiple perspectives, different ways and views of the world.